She'd been gone for 3 days when her phone rang. I was sitting in our bedroom, though it felt like mine alone now, holding that old flip phone she'd refused to replace for years. The funeral flowers were still fresh downstairs, their scent drifting up like a reminder that some things don't fade as quickly as we'd like. A notification lit up the screen, one unheard voicemail, time-stamped from last Sunday night. For 27 years, my wife made one phone call every Sunday evening, like clockwork. And I never once asked her why, because I trusted her with everything I had. After they lowered her into the ground, after everyone went home, after the silence became unbearable, I finally pressed play on that last message. And what I heard didn't just break my heart. It shattered everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd loved for nearly 3 decades. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that you never questioned them, then you'll understand why I never asked about those Sunday calls. See, trust isn't about knowing everything. It's about believing that what you don't know won't hurt you. And for 27 years, that belief held strong like a foundation poured in concrete. My wife wasn't the type to keep secrets. Or at least, that's what I told myself every time she'd step into the hallway, close the door gently, and make that call while I sat in the living room pretending not to notice. This isn't a story about betrayal in the way you might think, with affairs and lies, and the kind of family betrayal that tears people apart in obvious ways. No, this is something else entirely. Something quieter, heavier. The kind of weight that someone carries alone because they love you too much to let you carry it with them. Stay with me and subscribe to the channel, because this is just one of many true stories I share here that change everything we think about trust, family betrayal, and unimaginable secrets that are heard daily. And this one changed everything I thought I understood about the woman who shared my life. My name is William Carter. I'm 72 years old, and I spent 43 years of my life running Carter Food Logistics out of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing glamorous, just making sure groceries got from warehouses to grocery stores on time so families could put food on their tables. I started that business from scratch when I was 29. Just me and one beat-up delivery truck, and by the time I handed the keys to my nephew 5 years ago, we had 18 trucks and contracts with every major chain in the state. I'm telling you this not to brag, but so you understand the kind of man I am. Steady, reliable, someone who believes in showing up every day and doing the work, the kind of foundation you build a life on. Stella was the kind of woman who didn't need to announce herself when she walked into a room. Gentle, but with this quiet strength that made you feel safe just being near her. We met at a church potluck in 1996, both of us in our early 40s, both figuring we'd missed our chance at the whole marriage thing. She was a second-grade school teacher, had been for 15 years by then, and she had this way of making every kid feel like they mattered, like they were seen. I fell for her the moment she laughed at my terrible joke about casseroles, this genuine, full-hearted laugh that made me feel like I just won the lottery. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony, just family and close friends, and settled into what I thought would be the golden years, building something real, something that would last. Stella and I didn't have children of our own. Tried for years. Went through all the heartache and doctor visits and hope that kept getting crushed month after month. But eventually, we made peace with it and poured all that love into our life together. Our routine was simple, predictable in the best way possible. Saturday mornings at the North Market Farmer's Stand. Sunday pancakes that I'd burn half the time while she laughed from the kitchen table. Evenings on the porch of our little house on Maple Street, watching the sun go down over the neighborhood. It was the kind of life that doesn't make headlines, but feels like everything when you're living it. And honestly, I wouldn't have traded it for the world. But here's the thing about routines. They become invisible when love fills the room. Like wallpaper you stop noticing because you're too busy living your life. Every Sunday night, around 8:30 sharp, Stella would get up from wherever we were sitting, grab that old flip phone she kept charged on her nightstand, and disappear into our bedroom or sometimes the hallway. She'd close the door, not slam it or anything dramatic, just a gentle click that said, "I need a moment," and she'd be gone for maybe 10-15 minutes tops. Then she'd come back, settle in next to me on the couch, and we'd finish watching whatever show we had on or she'd pick up her book, or we'd just sit there in comfortable silence. I never asked what those calls were about because Honestly, it never occurred to me that I needed to. That's what trust looks like when it's real, when it's been tested by time and come out stronger. Looking back now, I can see how easy it was to let that pattern become part of the furniture of our marriage, something that just was without needing explanation. Stella never acted suspicious about it, never got defensive or weird when I happened to be nearby when she made the call. Sometimes I'd hear her voice through the door, soft and steady, though I could never make out the words and never tried to. A couple of times over the years, I noticed her eyes were red when she came back, like she'd been crying. But when I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd smile that gentle smile of hers and say, "It helps me sleep, honey. Just something I need to do." And that was enough for me, because in a good marriage, you learn that everyone's got their own ways of processing the world, their own little rituals that keep them balanced. We had our share of hard times like any couple. Money troubles when the business nearly went under in 2008. Health scares that reminded us we weren't getting any younger. The usual arguments about whose turn it was to take out the trash or whether we really needed to visit her sister in Florida again. But through all of it, there was this foundation of trust that never cracked. This understanding that we were on the same team no matter what life threw at us. Those Sunday night calls were just part of who Stella was, like her habit of organizing the pantry by color, or the way she'd hum old hymns while doing dishes. I figured maybe she was calling an old friend, maybe a relative who needed regular check-ins, maybe even a prayer line or something spiritual that gave her peace. Whatever it was hers. And I respected that because love isn't about knowing every single thing. It's about trusting that what you don't know won't change what you do. What I didn't realize then, what I couldn't have known until it was too late, was that some silences aren't about privacy. They're about protection. Stella wasn't keeping something from me. She was carrying something for someone else, a weight so heavy that she chose to bear it alone rather than let it touch our life together. For 27 years, every Sunday at 8:30, she stepped away from our perfect little routine and into a world I knew nothing about. And she did it with such grace that I never once felt the ground shifting beneath us. But the foundation was cracked, not because of lies or family betrayal in the way you'd expect, but because there was a whole story running parallel to ours, and I was about to discover just how much love can hide when it's trying to protect you. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was completely blind to everything, because that wouldn't be honest. And if there's one thing I've learned in 72 years, it's that lying to yourself is the fastest way to miss what's right in front of you. There were signs, small things that didn't quite add up. Little cracks in the routine that I noticed but chose not to examine too closely because, well, sometimes ignorance feels safer than knowledge. The first time I really paid attention was maybe 3 years into our marriage, back in 1999, when I came home early from a delivery route and heard Stella on the phone in our bedroom. Her voice had this tone I'd never heard before, soft but urgent, like she was comforting someone who was hurting. And when she came out and saw me standing there, she didn't look guilty exactly, more like she'd been caught carrying something heavy that she didn't want me to see. I remember asking her that night, "Is everything okay with that call?" And she looked at me with those warm brown eyes and said, "It's just something I need to do, Will. It helps me sleep." That phrase, "it helps me sleep," became her standard answer anytime I got curious over the years. And honestly, it was enough because I trusted her completely. But looking back now, I can see how that phrase was doing double duty. It was true in the sense that whatever she was doing brought her peace, but it was also a wall, a gentle way of saying, "Don't ask me to explain this because I can't." The thing is, when you love someone deeply, you learn to respect their walls even when you don't understand why they're there, and I figured everyone's entitled to their private corners, their own ways of dealing with whatever ghosts they're carrying. Over the years, I started noticing patterns that should have made me more curious but somehow didn't. Some Sunday nights, Stella would come back from that call with red, puffy eyes, like she'd been crying hard, and she'd curl up next to me on the couch without saying a word. Other times, she'd return with this peaceful smile, almost serene, like she'd just finished praying or meditating or something that centered her soul. And then there were the nights, maybe once or twice a year, when she'd come back looking absolutely exhausted, drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with emotional weight. I'd pull her close, kiss her forehead, and she'd whisper, "I'm okay, honey, just a hard conversation." And I'd leave it at that because pushing felt like I'd be violating something sacred. The calls themselves were always exactly 15 minutes, never longer, never shorter, like she had some internal timer that told her when it was time to wrap up. I know because I started paying attention without meaning to, glancing at the clock when she'd get up and checking it again when she'd return. 15 minutes on the dot, every single Sunday at 8:30 for 27 years straight. We went on vacations. She'd find a quiet spot and make the call. We spent holidays with family. She'd excuse herself right on schedule. Even when she had the flu so bad she could barely stand, she still dragged herself to the bedroom, made that call, and came back to collapse in bed. It was like a load-bearing wall in the structure of her life, something that couldn't be removed or skipped without the whole thing coming down, and I respected that, even though I didn't understand it. There was this one time, must have been around 2010 or so, when I almost pushed harder for answers. We were sitting on the porch after one of those calls where she'd come back crying, and I held her hand and said, "Stella, if something's wrong, if someone's hurting you or you're in some kind of trouble, you know you can tell me, right?" She squeezed my hand so tight it almost hurt and looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. Part gratitude, part sorrow, part something I couldn't name. "I know, Will," she said, "but this isn't about me being in trouble. It's about me keeping a promise I made a long time ago, before I even knew you existed. And that promise, it's the foundation of something important, something that can't crack just because it's hard to carry." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just held her, and we sat there watching the fireflies come out as the sun went down. The truth is, I chose not to dig deeper because I was scared of what I might find. Not because I thought she was having an affair or doing anything wrong, but because I could sense that whatever was behind those calls was big, heavy, the kind of thing that once you know it, you can't unknow it. Some part of me understood that Stella was protecting me from something, carrying a weight alone so I wouldn't have to feel it, and in a twisted way, I let her do it because our life was so good, so peaceful, that I didn't want to risk disturbing the foundation we'd built. But foundations don't crack because you look at them. They crack because the load is too heavy for one person to bear alone. And by the time I understood that, it was too late to help her carry it. Those Sunday night calls weren't just routine. They were Stella's way of holding up a whole other world that ran parallel to ours. And I was about to discover just how much that world had shaped the woman I thought I knew completely. Stella got sick in the fall of 2024. Right when the leaves were turning that brilliant orange and red she always loved so much. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away, the kind she kept brushing off as allergies or a cold that just needed time to pass. But by November, she couldn't hide it anymore. The fatigue, the weight loss, the way she'd have to sit down after just walking from the bedroom to the kitchen. The doctors found it in her lungs, stage 4, already spread too far for any treatment to do much more than buy a little time. 6 weeks, they said, maybe 8 if we were lucky. And I watched the strongest woman I'd ever known accept that news with the same quiet grace she'd shown for everything else in her life. Those final weeks were strange. Not in a bad way exactly, but in how normal Stella tried to keep everything despite what was coming. She still made her Sunday call, even when she was so weak I had to help her to the bedroom and prop pillows behind her so she could sit up. I'd wait outside the door, listening to the muffled sound of her voice, softer now, but still steady, still keeping whatever promise she'd made all those years ago. One time I heard her say, "I won't be able to call much longer, but I need you to know I kept my word. Every single week, I kept my word." I didn't understand what that meant then, but it settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold, the first real hint that there was so much more to this story than I'd ever imagined. She passed on a Tuesday morning in early December, peaceful in her sleep with me holding her hand. And just like that, 29 years of marriage ended in a single breath that never came back. The funeral was on Friday, a simple service at the same church where we'd gotten married, and I stood there in my black suit feeling like the foundation of my entire world had just been demolished in a controlled explosion. What surprised me, though, were the people who showed up. Faces I didn't recognize mixed in with our usual circle of friends and family. There was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, standing in the back row crying harder than anyone else in that room, his shoulders shaking like he'd lost something irreplaceable. And next to him, a woman around 45 or so, holding his arm and dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Both of them staring at Stella's casket like they were saying goodbye to someone who'd meant the world to them. After the service, during that awkward time when everyone's milling around with coffee and those terrible little sandwiches nobody really wants to eat, I noticed that same man and woman standing off to the side, whispering to each other and glancing in my direction. The woman looked like she wanted to come talk to me, kept taking a step forward and then stopping, like she was carrying something she didn't know how to deliver. I almost went over to introduce myself, to ask how they knew Stella, but then my sister grabbed my arm to introduce me to someone else, and by the time I looked back, they were gone. It struck me as odd, the intensity of their grief for someone I assumed was just an acquaintance, or maybe a former student of Stella's. But grief has a way of silencing questions, of making everything feel too heavy to examine too closely. The days after the funeral were the hardest, not because of the crying or the sadness, which were both there in waves, but because of the silence. Our house had never been loud. Stella and I were both quiet people who found comfort in each other's presence without needing to fill every moment with words. But this was different. This was the silence of absence, of routines that no longer had a purpose, of Sunday nights at 8:30 when nobody got up to make a phone call. I'd sit on the couch where we used to watch TV together, staring at her empty spot, and the weight of that silence would press down on me until I couldn't breathe. People kept telling me it would get easier with time, that the pain would fade into something manageable. But what they didn't understand was that I didn't want it to fade because the pain was proof that what we had was real, that she'd mattered, that our life together had been the foundation everything else was built on. About a week after the funeral, I started going through Stella's things, not to get rid of them or anything like that, but just to feel close to her somehow, to touch the clothes she'd worn and smell the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to the fabric. Her sister had offered to help, said it might be too hard to do alone, but I needed to do this by myself, needed to be the one to carefully fold each sweater and pack away each pair of shoes like I was tucking pieces of her memory into boxes for safekeeping. That's when I found the phone, that old flip phone she'd refused to upgrade for years, sitting in the drawer of her nightstand right where she always kept it. It was still charged, the little green light blinking to show it was on, and when I picked it up, my hands were shaking because I knew, somehow I just knew, that this phone held answers to questions I'd been too afraid to ask for 27 years. And once I opened it, there'd be no going back to the comfortable ignorance I'd been living in. I sat on the edge of our bed holding that flip phone like it was a live grenade, knowing that whatever was inside had the power to blow apart everything I thought I understood about the woman I'd spent nearly 3 decades loving. The phone felt heavier than it should, like the weight of all those Sunday nights, all those 15-minute conversations, all those years of quiet secrets had somehow transferred into this small piece of plastic and metal. My thumb hovered over the button that would open it, and I swear I sat there for a good 10 minutes just staring at that blinking green light, part of me wanting answers, and part of me terrified of what those answers might cost me. See, there's a difference between not knowing something and choosing not to know it. And I'd been living in that second category for so long that stepping into the first felt like walking off a cliff with no idea what was waiting at the bottom. Finally, I pressed the button and the screen lit up with Stella's wallpaper, a photo of us from our 10th anniversary trip to the Smoky Mountains, both of us grinning like idiots in front of a waterfall. The irony wasn't lost on me, looking at our happy faces while about to uncover whatever she'd kept hidden all those years. And for a second I almost closed the phone and put it back in the drawer, almost chose to let sleeping dogs lie and preserve the perfect memory of our marriage. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way those strangers had cried at her funeral, or the way Stella had said, "I kept my word," in one of those final calls. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that after carrying this weight alone for 27 years, she deserved to have someone finally understand what she'd been doing every Sunday night at 8:30. I navigated to the voicemail section, my hands still shaking. And what I found there made my breath catch in my throat. There were dozens of saved voicemails, maybe 100 or more, all carefully archived and labeled by date going back years. Most were outgoing messages, recordings of Stella's side of the conversation that she must have saved for some reason I couldn't fathom. But there, at the top of the list, was one incoming message marked as unheard, time-stamped from the Sunday before she died. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That sick feeling you get when you know you're about to learn something that changes everything. When the foundation you've been standing on is about to shift, and you have no idea if it'll hold or crumble completely. I stared at that unheard message for what felt like forever, my finger hovering over the play button, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop, to put the phone down, to walk away before I crossed a line I could never uncross. Part of me knew, somewhere deep in my gut where truth lives before your brain catches up, that whatever was in that message would rewrite the entire story of my marriage, would take 29 years of memories and cast them in a completely different light. But I couldn't stop myself, couldn't turn away from the truth even though I was terrified of it, because Stella had carried this alone for so long, and the least I could do was finally bear witness to whatever weight she'd been shouldering every single Sunday at 8:30. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for just a second, and pressed play. There was a long pause, just the sound of someone breathing on the other end, and then a voice came through that tiny speaker. A voice I'd never heard before in my entire life. It wasn't one of Stella's old friends, wasn't her sister or any relative I knew, wasn't anyone from church or the school where she taught. The voice was younger, filled with a kind of raw emotion that made my chest tighten. And in that split second before the words even registered, I knew with absolute certainty that my entire world was about to shatter into pieces I'd never be able to put back together the same way. That voice wasn't who I expected, not even close. And what it said in those first few seconds made me realize that the woman I'd loved for 29 years, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, had been living an entirely separate life every Sunday night, carrying a secret so big, so profound, that it had shaped every single day of our marriage without me ever knowing it existed. I sat there frozen, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to words that didn't make sense, that couldn't possibly be real, and yet were undeniably true. And I understood in that moment why Stella had never told me, why she'd carried this weight alone, why some foundations crack not because they're weak, but because the load is simply too heavy for one person to bear. I hit pause on that voicemail so fast my thumb almost went through the screen, my heart hammering in my chest like it was trying to break free from my rib cage. I couldn't breathe right, couldn't think straight, couldn't do anything except sit there on the edge of our bed with that phone in my shaking hands, staring at the pause icon like it could somehow hold back the flood of truth that was about to wash over everything I thought I knew. The voice I'd just heard, those first few words before I stopped it, they'd already planted seeds in my mind that were sprouting into terrible, impossible possibilities, and I wasn't ready, God help me. I wasn't ready to let them grow into full understanding. Some truths are like controlled demolitions. You can see them coming, but you still aren't prepared for the moment when the foundation gives way and everything comes crashing down. I set the phone down on the nightstand, stood up, and started pacing around the bedroom like a caged animal, my mind racing through 29 years of marriage trying to find clues I'd missed, signs I'd ignored, moments that might explain what I just started to hear. Every Sunday night for 27 years, Stella had made that call, and I'd trusted her completely because that's what love is supposed to look like, right? You give someone space to be themselves. You don't interrogate every private moment. You build a foundation of trust, and you stand on it together through whatever storms come your way. But now that foundation felt like it was cracking beneath my feet, not because Stella had betrayed me in the way you'd think, but because there was this entire structure of her life I'd never seen, never even suspected existed, running parallel to ours like a hidden support beam holding up something I couldn't yet comprehend. I walked over to our dresser and picked up the framed photo from our wedding day, both of us so young and hopeful, Stella in her simple white dress with that radiant smile that had made me fall in love with her in the first place. I traced my finger over her face in the picture. This woman I'd shared a bed with for nearly 3 decades, whose breathing I could recognize in the dark, whose moods I could read from across a room, and I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that maybe I'd never really known her at all. Or worse, maybe I'd known the version of her she'd allowed me to see while she carried this other life, this other love, this other promise in silence because she was protecting me from a weight she thought I couldn't handle. The thought made me angry and heartbroken at the same time. Angry that she hadn't trusted me enough to share it, and heartbroken that she'd felt she had to carry it alone. I sat back down on the bed, picked up the phone again, and just held it there in my hands, feeling the weight of all those archived voicemails, all those Sunday nights, all those years of secrets pressing down on me like a physical thing. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room, to smash it against the wall and let the truth stay buried with Stella where it couldn't hurt me anymore. But another part, the part that had loved her deeply enough to never question those calls in the first place, knew that I owed it to her to listen, to finally understand what she'd been doing all those years, to bear witness to the promise she'd kept with such dedication that she'd maintained it even on her deathbed. Whatever was in that voicemail, whatever truth was waiting on the other side of that pause button, it was the last gift Stella could give me, the final piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was supposed to be solving. I looked at the phone one more time, at that paused voicemail waiting to be heard, and I asked myself a question I should have asked 27 years ago. What did I never allow myself to hear? What truth had I been so comfortable ignoring because our life was good, and asking questions felt like it might disturb the peace we'd built together? Stella had given me the gift of ignorance, had protected me from something she thought would hurt me, and maybe she was right to do it. Maybe some weights are meant to be carried alone. But she was gone now, and that weight was sitting in my hands in the form of a flip phone with a voicemail I was terrified to finish listening to. And I knew, deep in my bones where truth lives before your brain catches up, that once I pressed play again, there'd be no going back to the comfortable life I'd been living. No way to unknow what I was about to learn. I pressed play again, and the voice continued from where I'd paused it. And this time I forced myself to listen without stopping, to let the truth wash over me no matter how much it hurt. "Mom," the voice said again, and that word alone was enough to make my hands go numb. "I know you're gone now. The hospital called me yesterday to let me know, and I've been sitting here trying to figure out what to say to you, even though you'll never hear this." It was a young man's voice, maybe late 20s or early 30s, filled with the kind of grief that comes from losing someone who meant everything. And I sat there frozen as he continued. "Well, for 27 years, you called me every single Sunday without fail, and I want you to know that those calls saved my life more times than I can count. They reminded me that I mattered to someone even when the whole world felt like it had forgotten I existed. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what this meant, who this person was. And then he said the words that made everything click into place like a lock finally opening after decades of being sealed shut. 'I was 3 days old when they took me from you,' he said, his voice breaking. 'You were 17, unmarried, and your parents gave you no choice. They said you had to give me up or they'd disown you, and you were just a kid yourself with no way to fight them. But you made me a promise that day in the hospital before they took me away. You whispered it in my ear even though I was too young to understand. You said, 'I will never forget you. I will find a way to let you know you're loved. I will keep you in my heart every single day for the rest of my life.' And you kept that promise, Mom. 27 years ago, when I turned 18 and the adoption records opened, I found you, and you started calling me every Sunday night, and you never missed a single week. The pieces were falling into place now. The foundation of my entire understanding shifting as I realized what Stella had been carrying all these years. A son she'd been forced to give up before I ever knew her. A child she'd loved from a distance for his entire life. A promise she'd kept with such dedication that it had become the load-bearing wall of her existence. He kept talking, and I kept listening, tears streaming down my face as the full picture emerged. You told me you'd gotten married, that you had a good life with a good man, and you asked me not to disrupt that, to let you love me from a distance so I could have my adoptive family and you could have your husband without the complications of explaining a son from before." His voice was thick with emotion. I agreed because I understood, because those Sunday calls were enough. Because knowing you thought about me every single day was more than a lot of adoptees ever get. You'd tell me about your students, about your life, about the man you loved, and I'd tell you about college, about my job, about the family that raised me, and for 15 minutes every week, I got to have a mom who chose me even when the world had forced her to give me away. I thought about all those Sunday nights, all those times Stella had come back with red eyes or that peaceful smile, and I finally understood what I'd been seeing. A mother loving her son the only way she was allowed to, carrying that weight alone because she thought it would protect our marriage from a truth she believed might crack its foundation. The voicemail was almost over now, and his final words hit me like a wrecking ball. "I'm so sorry I never got to thank you in person, never got to hug you or tell you face to face how much those calls meant to me. My adoptive parents were good people, they loved me and raised me right. But there was always this hole in my heart that only you could fill, and every Sunday at 8:30, you filled it for 15 minutes and reminded me that I wasn't a mistake, that I was wanted. That somewhere out there was a woman who'd never stop being my mother even though she couldn't raise me." He paused, and I could hear him crying openly now. "You kept your promise, Mom. Every single week for 27 years, you kept your promise. And I hope wherever you are now, you know that you were the best mother a son could ask for, even from a distance, even in secret. Even when the world said you had to let me go." The voicemail ended with a beep, and I sat there in the silence of our bedroom, the phone still pressed to my ear, my entire world recontextualized in a way I never could have imagined. Stella hadn't betrayed me. She'd protected me, carried a weight so heavy that she'd chosen to bear it alone rather than risk it touching our marriage, our peace, the foundation we'd built together. For 27 years, she'd been a mother to a son I never knew existed, keeping a promise she'd made when she was just 17 years old and powerless to fight the family betrayal that had forced her to give him up. And she'd done it with such grace, such dedication, such quiet strength that I'd never once suspected, never once felt the ground shifting beneath us, never once understood that the woman I loved was carrying a whole other life in her heart every single day. I thought about those strangers at the funeral, the older man and the woman in her 40s, and I realized with a jolt that they must have been him and maybe his adoptive mother, come to say goodbye to the woman who'd loved him from a distance for nearly 3 decades. The foundation hadn't cracked, I realized. It had held strong because Stella had been strong enough to carry the load alone. And now that I finally understood what she'd been doing, I felt the weight of it settling onto my own shoulders, heavy and profound and absolutely devastating. I don't know how long I sat there on that bed holding Stella's phone, staring at nothing, trying to process what I'd just learned. But when I finally looked up, the sun was setting outside our window, and the room was filled with that golden light she'd always loved. The weight of it all was crushing, not because she'd lied to me, because she hadn't. Not really, but because I finally understood how many times I'd mistaken her silence for distance, how many Sunday nights I'd sat on that couch completely oblivious to the fact that she was in the next room pouring her heart out to a son she'd been forced to give away before I ever met her. I thought about all the times she'd come back with red eyes, and I'd just kissed her forehead and gone back to watching TV, never pushing, never asking, trusting that whatever she needed to work through was hers to carry. And she'd let me believe that because she was protecting me, protecting us, protecting the foundation we'd built together from a truth she thought might crack it wide open. The guilt hit me like a freight train, this overwhelming sense that I'd failed her in the most fundamental way possible, that for 27 years she'd been carrying a weight that should have been shared, and I'd been too comfortable, too trusting, too willing to accept her silence as strength, when really it was just her being too afraid to ask for help. I kept thinking about that phrase she'd used, "It helps me sleep." And now I understood what she really meant, that those calls were the only way she could live with herself. The only way she could keep the promise she'd made to a 3-day-old baby in a hospital room when she was just 17 and powerless. Every Sunday at 8:30 for 27 years, she'd stepped away from our perfect little life and into the role of mother to a son who existed in the margins. And she'd done it with such grace that I'd never once felt like I was competing for her love or attention. But God, how lonely she must have been, carrying that secret, loving that boy from a distance, never able to talk about him or share her pride when he graduated college, or her worry when he was going through hard times. I picked up the phone again and scrolled through those archived voicemails, listening to snippets of Stella's voice across the years. And what struck me most was how much love was in every single message, how she'd managed to pour 27 years of motherhood into 15-minute weekly calls without ever letting it spill over into our marriage. In one message from 2012, she was telling him about a student who reminded her of him, how smart and kind the kid was, and you could hear in her voice this bittersweet pride, like she was imagining what it would have been like to watch her own son grow up. In another from 2020, she was comforting him through a breakup, giving him advice about love and trust, and how sometimes the right person comes along when you least expect it. And I realized she was probably thinking about us, about how we'd found each other in our 40s, when we'd both given up on the idea of marriage. She'd lived 2 lives simultaneously, one as my wife and one as his mother, and she'd done it so seamlessly that neither of us had ever felt shortchanged. And that took a kind of strength I was only beginning to comprehend. But here's what really broke me, what made me understand the true cost of what she'd carried alone. I didn't lose trust in her, not even for a second, because there was nothing to lose trust over. She'd kept a promise to a child who'd been taken from her, maintained a connection that any mother would fight to preserve. What I lost was my chance to carry the weight with her, to be the partner she deserved, to tell her that loving a son from before we met didn't threaten what we had. It only made her more remarkable. I lost 27 years of opportunities to support her through the hard calls, to celebrate with her when he shared good news, to grieve with her over the relationship they could never have in public. She'd protected me from a truth she thought I couldn't handle, and in doing so, she'd robbed us both of the chance to face it together, to let our foundation be strong enough to support not just our love, but hers for him too. That's the real tragedy of family betrayal, not the betrayal itself, but the silence it creates, the way it makes people carry weights alone that were meant to be shared. I made a decision right there in that bedroom with the sunset coming through the window and Stella's voice still echoing in my ears from those voicemails. I scrolled through the phone until I found his number, the one she'd been calling every Sunday for 27 years. And I stared at it for a long time, my heart pounding, knowing that what I was about to do would change everything, but feeling absolutely certain it was what Stella would have wanted. I hit the call button, and when he answered, his voice cautious and confused because he didn't recognize the number, I said, "My name is William Carter. I was Stella's husband, and I just listened to the voicemail you left her. I need you to know that she loved you with everything she had, and I'm so sorry I never knew about you while she was alive because I would have made sure you didn't have to love each other from a distance." There was silence on the other end, and then he started crying, really crying. And we stayed on that call for over an hour. 2 men who'd both loved the same woman in different ways, finally connecting the way we should have been able to all along. And when we hung up, I made him a promise, the same promise Stella had kept for 27 years. I told him I'd call every Sunday at 8:30, that I'd continue what she started, that her legacy of love wouldn't end just because she was gone. Love doesn't always ask for help, I realized. But it always leaves a path behind, and now it was my turn to walk it, to carry the weight she'd borne alone, to make sure her son knew that the promise she'd kept for nearly 3 decades would continue, because that's what you do when you truly love someone. You honor the things they couldn't tell you by making sure those things live on. So here's what I learned from all of this, and I hope it means something to you wherever you're watching from right now. Trust doesn't mean silence, and love doesn't mean carrying everything alone. Sometimes it means learning to listen too late and having to live with that weight for the rest of your life. Stella kept her promise for 27 years, and now I'm keeping mine. Every Sunday at 8:30 I call her son, our son really, and we talk about her, about life, about the foundation she built that's still holding us both up even though she's gone. If someone you loved ever carried a secret you never asked about, if there's a weight you're bearing alone right now because you think it'll protect the people around you, I want you to know that the strongest foundations are the ones built together, not the ones held up by one person in silence. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story touched you, hit that subscribe button right below this video, because there are more stories like this that need to be heard. Stories about real people, real love, and the complicated truths we all carry. Thank you.